Okay, hello everybody. I hope the sound and everything is well. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome all of you on behalf of Belletrina Academic Press. And let me welcome all of you in these online lectures that are going to take place in just a few moments here on this online platform. But before we start, allow me to make just a short introduction with some words about the project LITMAG. As you probably already know, this is an international project which brings together 8 organizations from different European countries. That would be Italy, Lithuania, Hungary, etc. And of course, Slovenia on the end. So hello from Ljubljana one more time. The project focuses on the Eastern European literary magazines, which have opposed authoritarian and totalitarian regimes and have significantly affected the process of democratization and joining the European Union after the Second World War. This is a project that puts some light on the crossroad between art and politics. And as a historical anthropologist, I must underline that this is an interesting project which is giving us an alternative position or an alternative view on the process of forming Europe and European Union in this post-Second World War period. I'm very honored to be part of this project, even if we can say just small role as today's moderator or the host. And before we start with our first lecturer, let me just emphasize that on the end, we will have some time for the Q&A, for questions and answers. And I think with this announcement, there is the moment where where I'm happy to announce our first lecturer. This is Professor Jolán Orbán. She's a professor at the University of Pécs, a wonderful city with a beautiful cultural center there. I've been there, a beautiful university. She comes from Faculty of Humanities, Department of Modern Literature and Literal Theory. Her lecture is going to talk about 3 historical moments that profoundly shaped the Hungarian history, the literary and political life in Hungary. I must say these are going to be 3 different revolutions in 1956 and 1968 and 1998. And of course, the aftermath of the Hungarian Revolution in the period of 1956. Especially, the professor is going to focus on the Tibor Tuskes Jelenkor. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And for the beginning, or for the end of the announcement, I would just like to say the title of the lecture is The Resistance to Political Power, Hungarian Literary Magazines 1945 to 2004. Professor Jolán Orbán, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introduction. I am very happy to be part of this movement, which we begin in the last years, concentrating mostly on the newspapers, but newspapers are never alone. So we are speaking every time also about the culture and the cultural relationship between your country, our country, and in Eastern Europe as well. Thank you very much mentioning our nice city, and I would like to say hello to your city in Ljubljana and welcome all my or our colleagues, parts of the project, or being at the moment working on the topics we will touch, and also our students who are here listening to this question. So I would like to begin my lecture with a quotation from Jacques Derrida. I am an expert of Jacques Derrida, so never we cannot escape. There is no democracy without literature and no literature without democracy. I think it's a very nice quotation of Derrida, and I would add also that there are no literary life without literary journals, and no democratic literary life with no democratic literary journals. So that's why I would like to focus this time mostly on Hungarian literary texts, but I would like also to shape and to show a little bit the relationship between Hungarian newspapers and Central and Eastern European newspapers. As you already mentioned, since the Second World War, literary journals have played a major role in Hungary, not only in preserving Hungarian cultural, linguistic, and national identity, but also in challenging political and political power. Three historical events from the period spanning between 1945 and 2004, it is the European Union when we entered, that's why we have this date, profoundly shaped the political life of Hungary and of countries of Central and Eastern Europe. This was the revolution of 65, this was the revolution from 56, 65, and the turn of the communism or the fall down of the Berlin Wall. And I think that these countries belong to the Eastern Bloc, to the same Soviet time communist regime. So they had a lot in common, and sometimes they had also, I think, a hard time, especially because of Czech Republic's revolution. In the aftermath of the Hungarian Revolution from 56, several representatives members of Hungarian literature were driven into political or voluntary exile. They were sentenced, they were silenced. So it was a very hard period in Europe, in Hungary, and I think otherwise, but also in the other countries. The communist regime put increasing pressure on journalists. That was censorship, that was imprisonment. And I would like to mention here that Tibor Santo from Pécs, I will come back, they were also removal in editorial boarding, for example, Tüskés Tibor, and also Colin Ferenc from Mozgóvilág, and also from Tiszatáj. And also they were prohibited, prohibition for authors to publish, as in the case of the Műhely Miklós. So this is why I think that this Hungarian story is related to the other stories, but it has somehow his special elements also. Now, I can tell it in short term that from the 60s and 70s onwards, the literary journal published in Hungary, they also were special issues consecrated to the special topics, and also they were organized public debates in Hungary, especially by Mozgóvilág, and also in other newspapers, Hungarian language newspapers in Kolozsvár, so in Transylvania, now belong to Romania, or in Pozsony, in Bratislava, in Slovakia, or in Új Symposium, this was in Yugoslavia. So they were at the time, these newspapers, also the organ, not only of the preserving the Hungarian language and culture, but also took part in the discussion in challenging the power. And also there were newspapers in emigration, as Magyar, Műhely, Bettina Sulyok will speak about, and all these newspapers together, they are also the authors, you will see they work together and had an eye on each other. They also were part of political and political resistance. I emphasize the political also because, as you know, we do not have now time to discuss all the problems in Soviet regime, but there was a literary and political forced movement to the so-called socialist realism. And these newspapers resisted to this standard. It was each has his own way to do it, but it was a political resistance as well. And I presuppose that this critical spirit, or critique in French, of literary journal and samizdat publications, I will mention some samizdat publications, played a decisive role in the revolution or the turnover in 1989 in the regime change, and had a great deal to be part of democratic transition in Hungary. Now, in my paper, I will only mention some of the newspapers. There are a lot of newspapers, but I would like to highlight some of them. And I would have 3 points to analyze a little bit the situation in Hungary, the manifestation and consequence of literary journal, resistance to political power, the role of literary journals in the democratic transition, and the role of women editors and authors in this process. I will focus mostly on the following journals. Jelenkor, you pronounce it very well, Thomas. Jelenkor, this would be in English contemporary, present time. Mozgóvilág, Utunk Helikon, they will come from Transylvania, Kolozsvár. Új Symposium from Újvidék, and samizdat journals, it's beszélő ellenpontok in medium art, because I think, knowing you are already hearing your text before, that we have here connection in the term of samizdat movement between Poland and Hungary, in Germany also. So this is also a question we could discuss in the next time, perhaps in the next frame and about the emigration or the newspapers in emigration, Magyar, Műhely, Sulyok, Bernadett will speak about. So as you see, there are newspapers in Hungary, there are newspapers, Hungarian newspapers in neighboring countries, Romania, Slovenia, and now Serbia, and I think that these newspapers work together, and not only to have and to be a frame of Hungarian nation, but they also were in connection with other Eastern European newspapers at the time. Now, the resistance of political and political power, as I mentioned, has two elements. Firstly, I think that in literature, even in the time when it was a deep, deep suppression, the polyphony of contemporary literature, the irrepressible polyphony of the literary language made a sort of resistance in that time. A lot of poets couldn't and writers couldn't publish their works, but we still have these works, and so we see this so-called resistance toward the power. On the one hand, and in the newspapers, sure, they were debates, they were literary texts, they were critical texts, and so on. And we can see that we have a double voice discourse practice during this year. It doesn't mean that the people accepted the political ideology, but they used a language, mostly in let's say in a parabolistic way, using the parabola. Kafkaesque, not the parabola which learns us and tells us stories because they don't want to tell us, teach us. No, these parables are speaking about the present situation. That's why they are more Kafkaesque. They need hermeneutics and the constructive way to understand them. But this double-voice discourse was present in the newspapers also. So it is more about discourse and not about the stories, but we can also follow and see how does it work, not only in literary journals, but also in art magazines, also in the theatrical piece, which were examined in our country by Jákvarné Magdolna, present here in this lecture. I think that the texts of women writers were present in this period. In the socialist country, there was a so-called proclaimed equal opportunities at the time, but as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, in the editorial chief, there were not so many women. It's something very interesting to be examined, and I think that communist system remained, and still, even they had the proclaimed equal opportunities, very patriarchal at the time, and we will see a change after the after the fall of the Berlin Wall of the communists. Now we have, the Hungarian colleagues know very well in Hungary, three notions: the treaty, tűrt, tiltott, támogatott. The newspapers were tolerated, prohibited, and supported. They were newspapers who were tolerated, even they were supported by the political power. Now I would like to focus only on the newspaper that they were against. Okay, so I explained this one because everybody in your country knows that there are a lot of newspapers which were conform to the ideology, but now we are interested in the newspapers which are not, we are not so happy about the situation in Hungary. I selected here for you some newspapers which I think are very important and were very important. Some both newspapers are also today, and I highlighted with the red the newspapers where their female editors, or they were present in editorial board, because you can follow how these newspapers, when they were founded, how were present. So in the Magyar Letter International, we have editress. She was from the first time, Katalin, until the present time. We have in Mozgóvilág now until the second part of Mozgóvilág, in Magyar Műhely as the present part, but only in the 2000. And in Újhold, it was a sort of newspaper we couldn't survive, but we have also female and male editors. That's why I think that it's very important to see how during the time this question was treated or presented in the newspaper. Before the newspaper, you see literary newspaper published in Hungary, literary newspaper published across the border. I would like also to mention not only from Kolozsvár, Equinox, it was a newspaper for the students. So I would like to also look at that, what the role of the students were in this element. I also have a calligram from Bratislava. You see in Pozsony, you see that it was founded in after the fall of the communists. And I also would like to mention here Muratai, because of Landwein, Slovenian friends. And I would like also to mention Hatodik Sheep from Beregszász from Ukraine. So you see that there are a lot of newspapers where they survive a short period or a longer period, it depends. But they were newspapers which had an effect, or it was against the political power. In Samizdat journal, sure, we have Beszélő ellenpontok, Médiumát. I will come back. We have more, but they are who are present in the present situation. Now concerning Jelenkor, because all the newspapers in Hungary had pretty much the same story. However, there were differences, but it happened because they were established at the same time, and they had every of these Hungarian newspapers in the 50s and 70s and 80s. There were periods when these newspapers were in danger because of the editors or authors who published their texts, and they were critical toward the political power. And in that sense, in Jelenkor, you see it was in 58 made and founded in Pécs. That's why we choose also, but not only because we are local patriots, but it has a major role in the contemporary Hungarian literature. It's a newspaper which edits contemporary literature and has a good relationship also with Belletrina and other newspapers in Eastern Europe. It was founded, as I told, in Pécs. It has several newspapers which were around, but as you see, I mentioned Sándor Vörös and Tibor Szántó, Csorba Győző. They were also not only editors, they were poets. So in this first period, there were a lot of poets taking part in the editorial board, and then some of them were needed to go also in jail or were prohibited to edit their texts. The 56th revolution was one which made, I think, clear that the Hungarian intellectual and the Hungarians are not happy with this communist regime, and this was a revolution which had a great impact on 20th century history of Hungary, and also in the literature. A lot of writers, a lot of intellectuals needed to go out from the country into emigration. Others were even judged or killed or forced labor and so on. So it's a revolution. You already know about it, sure. Only one element, when I think that to see in a level of the newspaper, that the newspaper in October of the Jelenkor predecessor was edited with a black color, and that's why the editor needed was punished. So it was an imprisonment of the editor. It means also that the political power didn't support this even symbolic gesture from the part of the so-called literary journals. So the literary journals were absolutely under survey at the period. Now we have here, and you can read it, sure, the story of the Jelenkor. What I would like also to highlight in Jelenkor, it was the text of Miklós Mészöly, one of the prominent writer in Hungarian literature, who published his drama Ablakmosó, window cleaner, in the Hungarian newspaper. And as a matter of fact, after publishing this one, it was a dismissal of the editor-in-chief in the newspapers, and even Miklós Mészöly couldn't publish during the next year because it was a parabolic Kafkaesque situation showing the story and of Hungarian at this period, and because some of the even ruling party members recognize that they are also the persons, or could be the persons presented in Ablakmosó. That's why it was a dismissal of the chief editor. After, it was a period of Ervin Szederkényi, the newspaper, which was also, he was the editor. He was not the writer, but the newspaper could have his own life, and from step by step could manage a new way of thinking, and even open the discussion more important for the democratic transition. Under the leadership of Csordás Gábor and István Csuhai and Zoltán Ágoston, the jelenkor, now the up-to-date jelenkor, is international. It's well known, a very good relationship with the neighboring countries, special issue after the Yugoslavian war about different post-ex-Yugoslavian literatures and country part of countries. So it was a vivid collaboration. And they also had a review between the review project, which means that invited other newspapers as editorial board and give out special numbers. I think it was, and it is, a very good collaboration at the moment. We had also a bilingual Hungarian and German edition, Jelenkor Anthology, in 93, which I think that is very important, because through this one, the German population could see how is it and how it works with newspaper. You have some to see how in the time the newspapers, also the newspaper image was changing, and it's now today the last one which is very much present. The Miklos Mészöly I mentioned is the author, one of the prominent authors in the 60s, from the 60s, and it was very important that he not only come back to the journal, but also had Péter Nádas, Eszterházy Péter, and a lot of new prosa writer coming to the Jelenkor. So that's why it's very important that his presence, it's for the Hungarian literature and edition, very important. Now let's have a look on the Mozgóvilág. I will go then faster because I think the time is over, and we can. Mozgóvilág was a very important literary and art magazine, and also interested in social issue, a liberal way of looking at the literary work. And I think it was very important. They had two periods, the first period and the second. The first period was the old Mozgóvilág. It ran until 83 by Kulin Ferenc. Then Kulin Ferenc was dismissed because of the newspaper's way of confronting the political power. And I think in this period, in the first so-called first period, in the old new Mozgóvilág, the so-called oppositional thinking and the sort of resistance, clear resistance to the power was made and articulated. Such artists as a writer, Eszterházy Péter, was also present in the newspaper. So but it was a very important newspaper which changed a lot the attitude, the climate, and the way of thinking in Hungary. And I think that's why we need to see also the Mozgóvilág editorial board to see the most prominent intellectual were part, and also they had to do with the avant-garde feelings and avant-garde way of looking. You see also that not so many women are present, but there are some. The new Mozgóvilág was edited in 84 and was led by Jolán Szűcs, also until today. They had another direction in the sense they were much more politically engaged in the leftist politics also. Now have a look on the Hungarian newspapers, Hungarian language newspapers outside the border of Hungary. I would like to mention only some of them from Kolozsvár, Klausenburg, Cluj in Romania, Transylvania. There were Utunk and after Helikon, and you give here Utunk and Helikon are working. They changed the name, but they changed not the spirit in the sense of dealing literature and also political debates. And you see here a number which goes back to Utunk and Helikon. It is a Dante number, a very nice number. The editors are here very importantly, and also here you can see that Szilágyi István, a very known prosaist, is the chief editor, and here you see also Demeter Zsuzsa, Eden Emese as women in editorial board, but the chief editor is Zsolt Krucsai. I would like for a moment to mention Szilágyi István because it's a very good artist and not only a writer. Kőulapadó kútba, it was a huge text, but it is translated, as you see, in different languages. So we see that there was a relationship between Hungarian and Eastern European artists. It is translated in German, it is translated sure in Romanian, it also in Polish language. Now, Új Symposium, Újvidék, Novi Sad, Serbia, it's a very, very important newspaper, a very fresh newspaper with a fresh spirit and political and poetical resistance to the politics, and we have Ladányi István present in this symposium. He is writing a nice text about monography about with symposium, and I think that he can express us why it's so important, these newspapers. You have a description of the newspapers, newspaper here, and I think the most important element it is what I highlighted it, that was also an opening to the popular culture, to experimental music, to neo-avant-garde art, to a critical and analytical thinking also, and that's why they had also problems with the ruling government. So that's why the editor in staff is János Sziveri, and it was also the editorial board. Some of them dismissed, and already they were under survey because they had this political power, and they wanted also to have not a very old type literature, but a very fresh and new type literature. So you see here the editorial board also, and Tolnai, Domokos István, Danyi Magdolna, Tomka Beáta, Radics Victoria. I name now also the women writer to see that the women writers were present, and they were part of this committee. The main author, it is Tolnai Otto from the beginning, and until now he's supporting not only as a person but also with his texts, which are very important texts in contemporary Hungarian literature, experimentals also. And here I choose also the Literatura na Świecie, the Polish newspapers, which is dedicated to Vojvodina, and also Tolnai Otto. And also I would like to mention they have now a Transylvanian part. To see also the relationship for a moment here, Beletrina translating contemporary Hungarian literature. So the newspapers have a very important role to share the new ideas and the new text, and then the editorial boards that you are making, and they are editing the text. We have a symposium that we have new symposium, with symposium, ex-symposium. It is now edited in Hungary, and they have also in Hungary, some of the editors are the same, coming to Hungary and making it in Veszprém. So the name is ex-symposium, but I think the spirit of also on resisting political and current literary trends are as same. Are the same. In bestseller, only to mention some of samizdat, we have the bestseller. This is the samizdat newspapers, and it was made by prominent leftist and liberal philosophers and writer, Kis János or Magyar Bálint, and I can name Iványi, so I can mention a lot of who made later on politics. But in the middle, I have Wagner Anna, because you know that in samizdat, the typists were very important, and sometimes they were more in danger as the other. Ellenpontok comes from Transylvania. There is a very important movement which led to the forced emigration of some authors, wanted to articulate the situation in Romania, in Ceausescu Romania. They were all Hungarian origin, and they had also very great impact later on the political resistance. The medium art, only for a moment to see the medium art, because I think that the art was very much present. This was also made by the people who are close to Magyar Műhely. We will have at the background. Now, only to have a look on magazine edited by the women in Hungary, you will see that it's Pécsi Juliana, Karádi Éva, Horváth Nóra, they are who are also today in the editorial board. We had also special issue about feminism and women studies of Hebdikon, Magyar Letterinternational Café Bábor in the 90s, you see. And we had also magazine edited by the women, Nők Lapja, for example, Glamour, and so on. There are no literary magazines, but I found a very interesting article comparing the Eastern European women magazine, and this one I found out there is the so-known Nők Lapja phenomenon. It means that in Hungarian Nők Lapja is very, very popular also today, and it is also because in this this is literature. So I presuppose that literary texts, if they are part of such literary magazines, they can be very effective. And I think that in the future, in the next time, I hope, I wish that in the editorial board of the literary magazine there would be more women in the name of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Orbán Jolán, for this extensive lecture. It's very interesting to hear. I hope there will be some time for some questions on the end also for you. I would like to be brief to save as much time as possible for our next lecture. This is Bernadett Sulyok. She's a chief museologist at the Petőfi Literary Museum, and she works in the Manuscript department. I'll just say the title of her lecture is the Magyar Műhely at the publishing ground for the artists living on the sides, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And as the title suggests, the lecture is going to talk about the magazine founded in the 1962, if the memory serves, and was interesting link between East and West. So, Ms. Sulyok, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So this is a great opportunity to participate in this lecture. In my intervention, I will talk about the brief history of the journal Magyar Műhely, and then the surveillance of the editors by the Hungarian State Security Service, and after some authors' opinions about the role of this journal. The journal entitled Magyar Műhely, Atelier Hongrois, was launched in Paris in May 1962 by young intellectuals who fled to Western Europe after the defeat of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. The founding editors were Pál Nagy and Tibor Pap. Alpár Bújdosó joined them from Vienna in 1973. The three of them shaped and defined the image of the magazine until 1996. Let's see the three main areas of this magazine. It's not only a literary, artistic, and critical journal, but a publisher of contemporary literary works and experimental albums. And very important is the community of artists who have gathered around the magazine to organize meetings, to discuss theoretical issues and each other's work. The editorial correspondence of Magyar Műhely magazine enriches our manuscript department in the Petőfi Literary Museum. Pál Nagy, Tibor Pap, and Alpár Bújdosó deposited their vast and impressive correspondence in our public collection, together with a number of their poems in traditional forms and visuals. In the museum's outstanding emigration literature collection, this corpus primarily represents the editorial practices and the literary and art theoretical orientations of the representatives of avant-garde artistic endeavors, thus making it possible to trace the history of the journal and the friendships and the confrontations of the artists who gathered around it. The editors were particularly interested in the oeuvre of Kassák Lajos, the most significant figure of the Hungarian avant-garde, who made a lasting contribution to literature and several fields of fine art. Kassák met several times with the editors of Magyar Műhely in Paris in the 50s. One of the special issues of the journal was devoted to his works. After the death of Lajos Kassák in 1971, the Lajos Kassák Circle and the Kassák Prize Foundation were founded in Paris with the aim of publishing the Kassák Prize annually, awarded to a talented young artist who has shown an outstanding initial achievement in literature or in fine arts. They have established productive working and friendly relations with other Hungarian cultural organizations in Western Europe, including the Mikes Kelemens Circle in the Netherlands, the Szepsi Csombor Literary Circle in London, and the Péter Barnabissa Society in Vienna. Since the late 1970s, they have regularly performed at international poetry festivals, such as the events organized by the French-based Polyphonics Association across Europe and other continents. In the 1980s, new technologies appeared, which gave rise to new genres: electronic poetry, electronic text literature, new tools such as the overhead projector, the video, and the computer, the emergence of concrete poetry, lettrism, phonetic poetry, and the creation of intermedia works of art. Their Ars Poetics was also presented in an exhibition at our museum in 2012. Avant-garde is not a style, but a way of thinking and a behavior. The link between Magyar Műhely and the Petőfi Literary Museum is one of the founding editors, János Parancs, who returned home in 1964 and became a well-known poet in Hungary and worked as a museologist at our institution from 1966 to 74. The editors of Magyar Műhely donated the first collection in 1970 during János Parancs's trip to Paris. In 2018, his legacy was also transferred to his former workplace, further enriching our knowledge about the journal. Most of the special issues published in the 1960s and 70s were dedicated to one of their predecessors or their role models. Their choices were intended to correct the value scale of contemporary Hungarian literature to focus on authors who were marginalized in Hungary for reasons of literary politics, as Jolán mentioned also. The ruling socialist canon assigned them to the tolerated category. The first special issue was produced to celebrate the 50th birthday of Sándor Vörös in 1964. The aim was to publish Hungarian and emigre authors together. Milán Füst was only presented in a commemorative issue because of his death in the meantime. Milán Füst's essay entitled Sexual Psychological Reflections was also published in a special issue. Miklós Szentkuti, a writer who was almost entirely silenced at the time, was featured in a special issue on the 40th anniversary of the publication of his novel entitled Prey in 1974. A special issue was also devoted to the Irish author James Joyce Finnegan's Wake. Now let's see the Magyar Műhely in the sites of the State Security Service. In Tamás Szőnyei's summary work entitled Secret Writing, State Security Service and Literary Life between 1956 and 1990, a special chapter is given to the surveillance of the paper by the secret police. He revealed how they tried to recruit almost all of the editors. László Márton, who had come to France from England, was cut off because of his provocation-suspected behavior. Pál Nagy's recruitment dossier was opened in May 1963 and was followed up by several people, but finally closed in December 1964. He rigidly refused our attempts to establish operational contacts. Among the founders of the paper, Imre Szakál was one of the leaders of the Association of Hungarian University and College Students, who was recruited as a spy under the pseudonym Sulyok. They constantly checked the Hungarian mail of Magyar Műhely. The publication of Sándor Vörös's poetry book Tűzkút, Firewall, in 1964 caused a major storm, practically provoking its publication in Hungary, which had been delayed for years. Vörös gave the manuscript to the editors in Paris for publication, and then issued a statement in Élet és Irodalom, Life and Literature, it's a weekly magazine in Hungary, as if he had not given permission. In order to protect Vörös, the editors even accepted the charge of piracy. The Viennese editor of Magyar Műhely, Alpár Bújdosó, was also approached. In 1965, the Atelier Kunstverein, in an association he had founded with his sculptor friend János Megyig, which provided an official background for inviting Hungarian writers and artists and covering their expenses, came to the attention of the State Security Services. In 1967, his dossier was closed as his nominee refrained from conspiring to keep it as open as possible. János Parancs returned home in September 1964, and his suitability for use by the Secret Service was also under scrutiny. But in 1965, the agent who had been assigned to him was disappointed to find that his reporting was not feasible from a conspiracy point of view, as he was a chattering, irresponsible figure. In March 1966, the agent alias Sziklai Barna reported that János Parancs had been assigned to the Petőfi Literary Museum as an assistant museologist a few weeks earlier. He was a literary historian, László Szekeres, who was instructed to establish direct contact with Parancs and to pass on information obtained from him. Barna Sziklai spent 10 days in Paris in June 1966, where he visited Pál Nagy and Tibor Pap, and on his return he gave a detailed report of his experiences. In a letter of the 22nd of February in 1965, Pál Nagy complains to Parancs about the banning of one of their issues. Numero 10 came back with this title, Non admis conv art 60 d'Ottawa. This particular article 60 says the following: it is forbidden to send fascist, anti-democratic and anti-Soviet printed matter, as well as abortion pills, to Hungary. Put the Műhely wherever you want. So the embarrassing and tragic case is that when the most violent and desperate attacks are being made outside, and the number of our active enemies increases in proportion to the prestige and quality of the review, and all that is left is to assassinate us, certain circles at home are also out to destroy us and would like to drown us in a spoonful of water. The reason for the return of numero 10 was the publication of an essay by the Viennese philosopher Tibor Hanák, entitled Ideology and Critique of Ideology, which criticized Marxist philosophy. In September 1966, the editors heard from several expatriates that the Magyar Műhely had been included in the Ministry of the Interior's exhibition entitled Spies and Divers. The journal was also attacked by some of the emigrant intellectuals for its excessive cooperation with the official Hungarian cultural policy. In a letter to Nándor Várkonyi, Pál Nagy wrote about their ideological affiliation. Our review is exclusively a literary, artistic, and critical magazine. We do not deal with politics. It's no secret to anyone, however, that its editors are left-wing and socialist. Domestic officials are well aware of this, which is why they do not attack the paper unnecessarily. However, they can no longer tolerate the fact that we have our own opinion. The situation at the moment is that the Copyright Office does not put up barriers to the posting of domestic manuscripts if they go through them. We have no choice but to try this option. Let's hope it works. Of course, we ask the authors to let us know the manuscript is on its way. Let's see some authors' opinions on the function of the journal. In 1973, the Magyar Műhely Working Group was established, and the journal was published as the paper of the working group. Pál Nagy, Tibor Pap, and Alpár Bújdosó became the editors in charge, and the working group formed the editorial board. The members of the working group were expected to publish regularly, at least once a year. The Magyar Műhely Working Group existed from 1973 to 1991, with 44 members from all over the world. Community building was considered important, and from 1972 onwards, Magyar Műhely meetings were organized every year or two, sometimes in Marly-le-Roi near Paris, and sometimes in Hadersdorf near Vienna on a predetermined theme. These meetings provided an opportunity for personal contacts and exchanges between Western European, overseas, and inland writers to discuss current artistic issues and to present their own experiments through lectures, debates, performances, and collective works. Elemér Horváth, a poet working in the United Okay, it's a dia about some visual poems just to illustrate my lecture. Eleanor Horváth, a poet working in the United States, wrote about their activities with appreciation. The Magyar Műhely is a serious fact of cultural history, but beyond that, it is also involved in something else, which is perhaps an even more serious phenomenon. Namely, Hungarian literature in the 20th century can probably be compared not to a circle, but to an ellipse with two focal points. One is inland, the other is what we call western. Surprisingly, the latter is more diverse, more colorful, more heterogeneous than the other. I almost said it was the stronger focus at times. Well, enough of the pomposity. Bálint Szombati started in his career in the 1970s in Novi Sad, Újvidék, at the Új Symposium, New Symposium magazine, and his conception is related to the Magyar Műhely's view. He considers the substance of art to be polyphony, openness to the world, the raising of new and new questions. For me, there is nothing more intolerable than mental immobility. József Bakúc, who worked in North America, shares the same conception of art. What is perhaps new in our generation, I think, is precisely the recognition that there can no longer be a single word reading, but that what it is important is that the text is an open system in which there are several possibilities of interpretation. For us, language is no longer a sacrament, but a tool, or if you prefer, one with our humanity, a marker of our taxonomy. The journal was repatriated to Hungary in 1989-90, and the editorial trio was joined by András Petőfi and Ákos Székely. In the spring of 1995, Zsolt Kovács, László Elsimon, and Zsolt Sőrés were invited to the editorial board. The magazine's themes and some extent its readership had changed, and it deals with not only literature, but also other artistic disciplines and theories. Currently, Bálint Szombati is the editor in charge of the journal, and András Petőfi is its editor. The Magyar Műhely Foundation, established in 1995, provides the legal background for the journal and the Magyar Műhely Publishing House. In 2004, the Magyar Műhely Gallery was opened in Budapest, which offers different contemporary artists and creative groups a chance to present their work every month. Of all the Hungarian language journals published in the West, only Magyar Műhely managed to survive after the regime change in 1990, and it is still the organ of contemporary experimental art. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. And our third lecturer today is Wolfgang Gorczacher, Senior Assistant Professor at the University of Salzburg, Department of English and American Studies, editor of Poetry Salzburg Review, director of Poetry Salzburg, and co-editor of Moderne Sprache. So many things. I had to have written everything not to forget something. And he's going to analyze the literary landscapes from the perspective of different little magazines. 30 literally artistic little magazines were published with a print run somewhere between 15 and 200 copies in the period after the rise of German Democratic Republic. What was the meaning of these magazines? This will be discovered in the lecture with the title Dream and Escape Attempt, Traum und Fluchtversuch, Ulrich Zieger, Oppositional literary magazine in the German Democratic Republic. So, Mr. Gorczacher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your very generous introduction. Lectures don't make any sense if nobody is online, which is why I want to start with passing on my thanks to my friends and colleagues from the Department of English and American Studies, as well as the members of the Austrian Association of University Teachers of English, and the contributors to a book, a companion to contemporary British and Irish poetry, 1960 to 2015, especially my friend and co-editor, Professor David Malcolm. The quotation in the title is the title of a poem by Ulrich Zieger, written in 1985 and published in issue 5 of the literary magazine Schaden, co-edited by the author between 1984 and 1987. I think it could serve as a motto for many attempts at publishing oppositional literary magazines in the German Democratic Republic. Just an outline, what I'm going to offer today: an introduction, a historical critical context. Then I will be talking about Peter Wensierski, very important book, Fenster zur Freiheit, die Radixblätter, Untergrundverlag und Druckerei der DDR-Opposition. I will be talking about the magazine Radixblätter. Then another aspect is the availability and accessibility of literary magazines. One aspect that has been covered by Professor Orbán already, which I think is especially important in, under inverted commas, my context, volumes celebrating a magazine's history. I will be talking about one particular issue 5 of Radixblätter, titled Oder literarische Texte. And finally, I will make some issues and some without many answers instead of a resume. Critics believe that the rise of the Samizdat literary magazines either started in 1979 with the publication of the anthology Papiertaube, and that was edited Paper Dove, edited by Dieter Kerschek, Lothar Feix, and Gerd Adler, and another anthology, Laternenmann, edited by Böhme. They are regarded as precursors of these oppositional literary magazines. Another opportunity is the Socialist Unity Party of Germany's Central Committee's resolution of 11th of November 1981, entitled Konzeption zur Arbeit mit jungen Schreibenden und anderen am Schreiben interessierten Bürgern. The concept for working with young authors and other citizens interested in writing, which requested, quote, an examination of the current legal basis for obtaining the professional title of author, as well as redefinition. In the future, only those should be allowed to call themselves writers who can provide evidence that they exercise their activities on the basis that they apply for membership in the Writers' Union of the German Democratic Republic or are contracted to a publisher. In the end, the proposed law for unquote, obtaining the professional title author, unquote, was never enacted. In his introduction to the book Die DDR im Blick der Stasi 1981, die geheimen Berichte an die SED-Führung, the German Democratic Feud by the Stasi, the secret accounts for the SED leadership, Matthias Braun argues that an article in entitled Eiszeit in der DDR, mit einem neuen Gesetz will Ostberlin den kritischen Künstlern beikommen, Ice Age in the German Democratic Republic. With a new law, East Berlin wants to get to grips with dissident artists, published in the West German magazine Stern on the 14th of January 1982, may have been the reason why this law was never enacted. At the same time, there had already been a massive exodus of writers since Wolf Biermann's expulsion in November 1976, which may also have been among the reasons why the SED dispensed with the proposed legislation. Nonetheless, Peter Geist argues, quote, This exclusion of half a generation of young authors from the GDR's literary industry led to the opposite of what was intended. It strengthened the group cohesiveness of the excluded. Until the end of the German Democratic Republic, around 30 literary artistic little magazines were published with a print run, as Thomas has already pointed out, of 15 to 200 copies. Among them are Mikado, published between 1983 and 1987, 9 issues, edited by Uwe Kolbe, Lotta Trolle, and Bernd Wagner. Another one that I would want to mention is Ariadne Fabrik, again published between 86 and 89, but published 24 issues and edited by Rainer Schedlinski and Andreas Kotziol. Another one is already mentioned Schaden, published from 84 to 87, published 17 issues and edited by Egmont Hesse and Sascha Anderson, among many others. Finally, I would want to mention Anschlag, published between 84 and 89. 10 issues were published, 2 special issues, and edited by Angelika Küsendorf, Wiebke Müller, and Karim Saar. While conducting research in the past 8 to 10 months, I got in contact with the journalist Peter Węgierski, the author of, and now the English title, Window to Freedom, the Radiksblätter, underground press and printer of the GDR Opposition, published by Mitteldeutscher Verlag in 2018. The second edition was published a year later, which is a fascinating study of an oppositional magazine and the protagonists Stefan Bickert on the left and Ludwig Mehlhorn on the right, in the context of an alternative and dissident culture. Peter Węgierski has been very generous. He has not only offered his outstanding expertise, but also provided me with many sources, both in print and visual ones. I would like to express my gratitude to him. He will also be the honorary guest speaker on the 26th of April at the event in the context of our project and the traveling exhibition at the University of Salzburg. So if you're around on the 26th of April, it's a Wednesday, we'll start at 6, and hopefully it will also be possible to welcome Stefan Bickert, one of the editors, until together perhaps with a colleague from Oxford, but I'm still waiting for their confirmation. The first issue of Radiksblätter is the result of a literature camp on the premises of the East Berlin Stephanus Foundation, Weißensee, organized by Bickert and Mehlhorn, and it focused on Paul Celan's oeuvre. The magazine's title is derived from Paul Celan's poem Radix Matrix. And I'm quoting from an interview with Stefan Bickert. In it, Celan commemorates his murdered parents. Radix means root, getting radically to the root. New critical ideas ought to be disseminated. That's it, I thought. This is how the idea developed to not just publish a one-off issue, but a Samizdat series of issues under this title, unquote. Between December 1986 and August 1989, 13 special issues were published according to no fixed publication schedule on topics such as Schattenverschlüsse zu Paul Celan, shadow clubs on Paul Celan, oder literarische Texte oder literary texts, Spuren zur Geschichte der Friedensbewegung in der DDR, traces about the history of the peace movement in the German Democratic Republic, and finally, Atem, Texte und Grafiken, breath, texts and graphics. Something hardly any critic, whether in the German or English language context, has done so far is to look more closely at the issues of literary magazines, in particular embark on a close reading, analysis and critique of the literary texts. The major reason may be the lack of availability and accessibility of issues of these magazines. Due to the small print runs, they have become collector's items. Also due to the transient materiality of these issues, it is not possible to order issues through the interlibrary loan service. Sometimes it is possible to receive a PDF file of an issue, but in the majority of cases, the situation once again requires interested researchers to work in archives. And this is what I very much welcome. One of them is the Sächsische Landesbibliothek, Staats- und Universitätsbibliothek, the so-called SLUB in Dresden. It owns an extensive collection of magazines from the 1980s. The thematic portal Artist Magazines of the German Democratic Republic presents this collection, in which, as a result of a joint project between the Institute of New German Studies and the SLUB Dresden, that was founded by the German Research Council from 1997 to 2000, these unique original works can now be seen in digital form. Besides providing direct access to the digitalized versions of 177 issues of 24 different magazines, this portal offers an introduction and overview of the topic of artists' self-published printed matter. They're called artist magazines because the editors integrated illustrations into the written texts in order to evade the infamous 1979 so-called Druckgenehmigungsgesetz, law governing printed matter. Illustrations were governed by a different law from printed text and only required official approval when produced in large print runs. Only a very small number of editors and scholars have taken the initiative to edit and publish volumes celebrating a magazine's history. One such volume, Mikado, oder der Kaiser ist nackt, Mikado, or the Emperor is Naked, published by Luchterhand in 1988, assembles a selection of contributions printed in the 10 issues of Mikado, a magazine published from Berlin with a print run of 100 copies of each number and edited by Uwe Kolbe, Lothar Trolle, and Bernd Wagner. A second such volume, entitled Abriss der Ariadne-Fabrik, published by Edition Galref in 1990, highlights the achievements of the magazine and offers a selection of the contributions published in its 22 issues between 1986 and 1989, with a print run ranging from 40 to 60 copies. To return to Radik's Blätter, such a volume of selected texts and artwork published in the magazine between 86 and 88, entitled Unterbrochenes Schweigen, Interrupted Silence, and edited by Peter Ulrich, Maria Noke, both from the Leibniz Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam, and Stefan Bickert, will be published later this year. After this digression, I would like to return to my original plan, and that is to study one issue of Radik's Blätter more closely and raise a couple of issues without always offering answers. In the context of our project, especially with our Polish partners in mind, the fourth issue, Oder literarische Texte, is the opus one to choose. It was published in June 1987 for a print run of 500 copies. So Radik's Blätter is exceptional if compared to other literary magazines. It was preceded and came into being by a call for contributions. And this is the call for contributions, entitled Polen im Kopf, Poland in the Mind. The editors, Michael Patoszek, Michael Melhorn, and Joachim Zeller, define Poland in the following way. Quote, a white spot on the map marks the unexplored regions of the contemporary world. In the mind, the white spot is called Poland. Terrain, not described, not written down. Every now and then, a pale shimmer of the past. We pull the ends of broken threads, which, having weathered over the years, aren't any good to tie a row. Poland lies in the back of the mind, and it is not a graveyard, but the cradle of ideas inspired by memory, unquote. In their introduction to the issue, the editors characterized their aims and ambitions for the issue. Despite the differences in historical experiences and religious traditions, despite the language barrier and the impression that for many Germans, Poland seems strange, the editors, quote, were looking for literary testimonies for dialogue between Poles and Germans, which are binding. We did not find them, but we offer multiple attempts to get closer. Texts by Polish authors should help us look at the foreign and perhaps provide a critical questioning and consulting the other alongside our patterns of values, thought, and behavior. This is, unquote. This is a quotation from the introduction to the issue. The issue is introduced by the poem On Angels by the most prominent Polish poet at the time, Czesław Miłosz. Please excuse my Polish pronunciation. I usually practice it with my friend, Professor David Malcolm, but there's always improvement possible, despite the fact that his books were banned at the time in the German Democratic Republic. The translation by Karl Deditius, first published in the volume Gedichte, 1933-1981, Poems, 1933-1981, published by Sulyok in 1982, is a reprint. Węgierski points out that Ludwig Melhorn often had to rely on already published texts, as he couldn't get a visa for Poland due to the travel bans at the time. Extensive extracts from Miłosz's Nobel lecture were translated by Melbourne from a Polish underground magazine and published for the first time in the German Democratic Republic. Poems by Miłosz, some of them in the Polish original, followed by German translations. The prose poem by Konrad Weiss, entitled in English translation, Storm and Silence, in remembrance of Jerzy Popławski, was written to commemorate the Polish Roman Catholic priest who became associated with the Opposition Solidarity trade union. He was murdered on the 19th of October 1984 by 3 agents of the security service of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. This political and dissident poem makes use of biblical allusions and highly figurative diction, and is nonetheless experimental in its nature, using lowercase spelling and tightly knit sound patterns by way of alliteration, consonants, and assonance, which support its syntactic and rhythmic structures. A photograph taken by the poet follows on the next page, which shows a crucified Jesus at Popławski's grave in Warsaw. Another commemorative poem by Günter Kunert, entitled Epitaph for Tadeusz Borowski, is reprinted from his collection Der ungebetene Gast, published by Aufbau Verlag in 1965. Other East German poets represented in the issue are Uwe Kolbe and Rüdiger Rosenthal. Ludwig Melhorn translated texts by, among others, Julia Hartwig, Hanna Kral, Richard Mirski, Sławomir Morzek, Adam Zagajewski, and some others. Sometimes poems initiate a dialogue due to their deliberate placement next to one another. For example, Esther Marie Ullmann-Görlitz, a pastor from Klein-Neuhausen, contributed her poem Slavischer Marsch, Slavic March, and dedicated it to Josef Baran and his friends, and in addition her translation of Baran's poem Empfindlichkeit. Prose contributions to the special issue include Stefan Bickert's review essay discussing Adam Michnik and Helga Hirsch's book Polnischer Friede, Aufsätze zur Konzeption des Widerstands, Polish Peace, Essays on Designing Resistance, published by Rotbuch Verlag in West Berlin in 1985. They also include Ludwig Melhorn's essay about the Polish underground journal Res Publica, which was launched in 1979. Now, finally, instead of a resume, at the time of its publication in 2018, Peter Węgierski's book sparked off great interest in Radik's Blätter. There was a traveling exhibition in a so-called Kulturwagen at different venues in Berlin, a traveling exhibition. Wensiewski was invited to give many readings, for example, in Theater Pach in Berlin. Interviews and articles appeared in journals such as the German weekly Der Spiegel. Der Archivbewegung Leipzig holds a traveling exhibition entitled Radixblätter, an Untergrundverlag in der DDR, an underground press in the German Democratic Republic, which consists of 12 boards to hang and can be borrowed upon acceptance of the transport costs. And I've managed to get it transported to Salzburg, and it will support the traveling exhibition of our project starting next week. On the 8th of April, 22, Eva Ni Koihan hosted a roundtable discussion, poetry readings, an exhibition, New College and the Taylor Library, Oxford. These events were the culmination of a doctoral research so far on the unofficial literary scene in East Berlin in the 1980s. Hahn published PhD thesis entitled Dangerous Creations, Power and Autonomy in East Berlin's Samistadt, investigates the subversive literary scene of the German Democratic Republic in the 1980s through in-depth case studies of 3 individual East Berlin magazines, that is Mikado, Liane, and Ariadne Fabrik. She worked closely not just with archive material, but also with those who once created these magazines. The aim of this table discussion was twofold, quote, to bring together the artists and writers with whom I had been working as part of my PhD project in order to continue discussions about the unofficial magazines of the German Democratic Republic. And secondly, to eventual broader conclusions about the afterlife and cultural significance of the unofficial scene today. Dangerous Creations, papers from a roundtable discussion, and you see the cover, was published in August last year. And I hope that I will manage to invite Dr. Ni Kroihan to Salzburg, we'll see. In a recent correspondence with Professor Karen Leder, the supervisor of Ni Kroihan's PhD project, she is also Schwarz-Taylor Chair of the German language and literature at New College, Oxford, and she drew my attention to a graduate's research project. So my thanks go to Professor Leder. She also confirmed one major obstacle to a wider, perhaps worldwide interest and reception and overdue appreciation of the work published in these Samistadt magazines. That is the lack of translations into English. My suggestions for a future project: edition and publication of further anthologies, such as are available for Mikado, Ariadne Fabrik, and forthcoming Radixblätter, as well as related translation project. And finally, interviews with editors, if not yet available, but also perhaps in addition as a possibility to critique their own work with hindsight while they are still alive. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Korczacha. Thank you for all your suggestions and lecture and everything. So, dear attendees, now it is the time to collect all the impressions, the ideas to form the questions. But in the meantime, when you do that, I will just emphasize that as you could have seen, we are recording these lectures, and all the recordings are going to be available on the web page of our project LITMAG. So you will be able to see them, listen to them in a short while when our techniques and this technical support are going to upload it to there. So if there are any questions, please tap this yellow hand that we will see, and our support is going to unmute you to hear you. I don't see any hands. So if there are no hands, I think we will have to end it then. Okay, it seems there are no questions. even though I would like to thank to all of you, especially to our guests, on behalf of Belletrina Academic Press, and of course, thank you also to all the other attendees. Thank you very much. Have a very pleasant day, and we are sending sun all around the Europe from Ljubljana. Here's a sunny weather, and we are sending all this beautiful energy all around the Europe, and have a beautiful weekend. Goodbye.